Thank you. It is good to be here with you folks this morning. This is not the first church that we've been in since we came in on July 4th, but have been out in eastern Pennsylvania and just came in the end of this last week. But as was already mentioned, this is our home church, and of course Julie grew up here. I talk kind of loud, sorry, so you're probably I'm just getting warmed up, so keep turning it down as I go. I always talk soft at the beginning. You'll notice my volume gets louder as I get going, and my speed increases. And when I start rocking like this, I'm really going. So we'll get going here in a minute. It's amazing because I haven't been here for 3 years, but it was actually 26 years ago this week on this platform that Julie and I were married in front of many of you people. And then 6 years later, we were commissioned to go to Portugal from this very platform as well. And a few years after that, 3 years later, we were ordained and had an ordination service on this platform. And so I don't know what comes after that. Maybe I don't want to think about it. But we've been pretty connected here. And every once in a while, they let me back in here to speak to you folks, and I appreciate that and enjoy that. And we have the opportunity of coming in every so often, so we kind of see maybe changes more than you guys do. And it's interesting as we pass around the churches to see those changes and see good health and support from here. And I just want to thank you right up front. We're living in difficult financial times. Everyone is. That's all you hear all the time. And yet this church, along with others, but especially this church, has been very faithful over the years. We've been almost 20 years in Portugal now. But even just recently have really stepped up to meet the financial needs that we've had. And we know that it's not easy for you guys to get up on Monday morning and go to work, and not everyone loves their jobs. And to give some of that money away to Tim and Julie riding around in Portugal on their motorcycle or basking in the sun or whatever may not seem like something that you would want to do, but we know that it comes from a loving heart. And I trust as you learn more about what God's doing in Portugal that you'll see that your investment there has been well worth it. You're going to be the first church to receive our prayer card that we just got this week. And so you can feel honored, I guess, and you can pick that up in the back. Along with the other prayer cards, your refrigerators will be well decorated by the end of the day. So pick up all these prayer cards, put them on there. You'll see our girls there. Our girls are back in Portugal. Someone was just asking about that. I heard Mike Jenna say that he has a kid going in 7th grade. Was that right? And I was thinking that has got to be impossible. But then I have 2 that will be college age this year. So I guess anything is possible. And time keeps going on, and we keep getting a little bit older, I guess. But you can see our girls in the picture there. And since you can't see them in person, Stephanie is just finished her first year in the Fine Arts School in Porto. And Sarah is in fact, last week she just finished her big exams for going into the university this fall. She's going to be looking into going into biology or something in the sciences. And then Suzanne, our youngest, is going to be 16 in September, and she's going to be going into 11th grade. So these kids are growing up, they're studying hard and doing well. And you can also see our little dog that is in the picture there too, which we found in the trash can last summer. And we have adopted, actually Stephanie found it in the trash can and brought it home. And we've adopted it, and it's now part of our family too. And you have a nice shot of Porto in the background there. And so that one has our contact information on the back. So you can pick that up. Well, let me just give you a real brief update on the way things are going in the church, and then I wanted to share some things from the Word. Like I said, we've been there almost 20 years now, and you may remember as we were sent out, Julie and I were the first with Grace Brethren to go to Portugal, and we flew out of Chicago, and there was a lot of adventures because the plane didn't go and stuff like that, and the car broke down the way to the airport, and it was a great adventure getting there. But we got there, and you may remember that we studied then for about a year and a half in Coimbra, where we studied language, and then went up to Maya, just outside of Porto. And then came back here for our first term in our first home ministries in '93, and that's when Susanna was born. And then went back, moved down into Porto, and began a focus on young adults and basically trying to see a church planting movement started. Well, in that time, we've been able to see 2 churches started. In 1997, the Portuguese-speaking church, the Comunidade de Graça, was founded, and you guys are familiar with the names in that of some of our leaders, especially Gami during this last year, and I'll be talking a little bit more about him. And then about 6 years ago, we saw the need to start an international church because we were seeing a lot of non-Portuguese speakers coming into our Portuguese church and having difficulty in following what was going on and integrating and so forth. And so we partnered with Christian Associates. They had started a church in Lisbon, and we started a international church. Started our home for about 3 months, and then we were able to find a place where it meets now. And in fact, that place has been great because the English couple that's working with us on that and is heading up that work right now is he works for Rolls-Royce Engine, so he works full-time. He just left that job, retiring, and we're trying to get him to be working full-time with the church. But because of his job, he was able to support himself and to rent a pretty nice place that came with a little indoor pool, which we call baptismal. And so some of you have seen, in fact, if you haven't seen it, I can pull it up for you later, but we have a video clip of Susanna being baptized by Gami. And we do a lot of things together with the 2 churches. We see them as sister churches. And Portuguese-speaking English, they actually take, the meetings on Sundays take place at exactly the same time. They're in 2 different places because we don't have a space big enough to have them in the same place. We're toying with that idea because after our meetings, we always have a meal together. And we thought it'd be pretty cool that if we could have the 2 language meetings going on and then come together all together for the meal afterwards. But right now we're meeting in 2 different places. But we get together. We were getting together every month, but it was getting a little bit laborsome trying to do all the translation and everything. And so we get together about 4 times a year. We do, what I mean is the 2 churches. The church meets every week. But the 2 churches get together. We do retreats. And so it's been a really neat cooperation between those 2. And that's one of the things I constantly am asking people to be praying about is that to maintain that cooperation, because I think that's pretty important. When we get to heaven, there is going to be a multitude of languages, and we believe that that is one way that God, even here on earth, shows the beauty of His bride, is through the great variety of nationalities and languages that are expressed in His church. And to do that on a local level is a pretty neat thing. And so to see the Portuguese worshiping in our international church 12 different language groups, or nationalities is something that's pretty cool, and I think is a great testimony of what God can do, and going beyond the barriers of nationality, of race, and everything else. And so that's where things are at right now. This last year, I pulled out of the leadership team of both of our churches, and basically have moved into a mentoring model with the head elders in each of those groups. And the churches have really developed well without us being part of that. And so we're looking in the fall to go back, partnering with our teammates Sam and Tracy, in refocusing again on university work and mentoring leaders who will go out. Based on the Acts chapter 19 model, you probably don't remember, but years ago we talked about the through the doorway strategy. And we're based upon the model of Paul when he went into Ephesus. And in Acts chapter 19, it says he was thrown out of synagogue, so he went over to the school of Tyrannus and set up school. And the interesting thing there is that as he trained men, they were sent out, and that entire region was, the name of Jesus Christ was made known in that entire region. And so that's what we are seeking to do as we work there in the north of Portugal. Now, we've started to work in Lisbon. Some of you are familiar with the name of Alfredo and Rita Abreu. We are seeking, and I think this will be the model of what we're going to be doing in Europe, probably across the board, but seeking to start the work in Lisbon without any American involvement. And so Alfredo and Rita are part of our team, but they live 3 hours away. And they have joined together. They're forming their own team. They have a small group there that is on the verge, I guess you could say, of being declared a church. Probably during this next term, it will be declared a church. And they're meeting weekly and have a good group going there. And Alfredo is emerging as one of the key leaders even on a European level with the associates that we've talked about, Beate had talked about in the Sunday school hour, these Charis associates or national workers or whatever you call them here now. But they are the Europeans who are working with the European church. With the rising cost of living there and the falling dollar and everything else, It's an impossibility that American missionaries are going to be able to do the job. And that's what I think God's plan is anyway. And so we need to be investing in doing our part as American missionaries in equipping and sending out nationals that are there to do the work. It's the only way we're going to see a true movement begun. And so we're seeing a number of nationals from the different countries teaming with us and being sent out. Now, what I had prepared to share this morning, actually, before I left Portugal, is completely different than what I'm going to share. Because God brought us in this last year, our church, each one of us individually, through an amazing thing. 26 years ago when I stood on this platform, I don't know if they do this anymore with the vows, but one part of the vow is for better or for worse. And it's the 22 or 21 or 23 or whatever age you are when you get married, you're old up here. You're probably thinking more about the better than the worse at that point. Now, 26 years on, you're probably thinking more about the worse. I don't know. But the better is all you're thinking about. And when you go into ministry, into the church, it's a lot the same way. You're thinking better or worse, but when you start up a church plant, you're thinking the better. And it's been an amazing thing in our church, because the Portuguese church started in 1997, and so it is 12 years old now. And God has, there's never been a point of crisis, really, until this last year. And that point of crisis came into us in a very unexpected way, because a lot of times you're looking for spiritual attacks. Now, I believe everything's spiritual, so even physical things that happen are coming from a spiritual root. Satan is trying to destroy what God is doing there. But we were expecting more of a spiritual attacks or something like that. And yet what happened as you know, the story of Gami, is that God allowed a physical attack to take place where we almost lost, the doctors had declared him dead, no hope, our main elder. And that was an amazing thing. We've lived through a lot of interesting things and challenges. You may remember, I think the last time I was here, I shared the story about Casimiro, the first guy that came to Christ in our motorcycle club, and then 3 months later was killed in an automobile accident. And yet, within days after that, it was an awful thing, and we cried and struggled through it and asked God, why would you take away the first fruits of this ministry? And yet, they turned around, and great things came out of that. And many more people heard of the gospel through that. People gave their lives to Christ, and it was just, we could see God, how through a bad thing, God really had worked. Well, this wasn't the case with the Gami story, and I'll be sharing some of these things in a minute. But when it gelled for me was when we were together as missionaries, and Diana and Yate were there too, and Larry DeArmy shared with us from Psalm chapter 23. And when he was sharing, I realized what he shared. In fact, Larry and I are very good friends, so it could be that he had actually prepared that message just for me. I don't know, but it seemed like he had just prepared that message for what had gone. And he had been very close to us during that time, and I can remember ministering to the family there, and then going back just totally exhausted, laying down in bed. And Larry would call, and we'd talk and stuff, and just offering encouragement during that time. And so it could be that he prepared this. But when I heard what he had to share from Psalms chapter 23, I realized that's what I need to be sharing as I travel around the churches. Because it really answers the question for me anyway, not of why we have crisis in our life. We have crises in our life. Normal life, we have a friend who talks about living life on life's terms. Bad things happen. You're not going to avoid them. And when you're running around doing lots of stuff and you're doing stuff for God, bad things are going to happen. Julie had an automobile accident the week before we left. And a lot of what happened to us last year started from another very serious automobile accident she had the year before, which went to the courts and all that kind of stuff. And it was a huge mess. And when you look at those things, you say, why do we have so much bad luck? Well, we don't have so much bad luck. It's just, if you saw the roads in Portugal, you'd understand. But bad things happen. You have to deal with it. You have to live with it. And we are in a crisis in this country. You hear about it all over. People lose jobs. I spoke in York, Pennsylvania 2 Sundays ago, and right after I got done, I went back to the back, and after I shared this, and the girl said, I just lost my job yesterday. What you said, she was crying, she said, what you said was spoken directly to me. Because I don't want to really deal with why we have crises, or what the whole idea of dealing with crises. But to answer the question, why does God allow us to go through crises? What is His purpose in all that? because I have to believe fundamentally that God has a purpose in everything that happens. And when we have an automobile accident, or when our head elder is in a plastic sack, which he was sitting on the hospital bed in a coma, and the doctors are declaring dead, I have to ask, God has a purpose in this. And it really came to me during that period last August as we were dealing with all this. Someone said to me, it was Alfredo in Lisbon, he said, don't ask what God is trying to teach you. Ask God to transform you. And I began to think about that, and I prayed that prayer. Because too often I think we are trying to be God's student, and God is really trying to make us his piece of art. The idea of he is the potter, I am the clay. A lot of times we're trying to figure out what he wants to teach us up here and not allowing him to transform us down here in our hearts. And so as I prayed that prayer, and others in our church prayed the same thing, we began to see God do some amazing things in our group, and begin to realize that God's purpose in all that wasn't to teach us something. You can go back and read the book of Job to learn some about that, but to really transform us as a body of believers there, as a Gami himself, as a leader in the church, and Julie and I too as missionaries there. A lot of times during this process we ask the question, why Gami? Because if anybody, Gami would be the last person that we think that God would allow to go through that. And yet we realize that God chose him because he could touch every person's life in that group, including Elena's unbelieving family through the process. I'll get to that later. Elena's dad prayed for the very first time in his life. And so God knew who he could touch. If he had done that to me, Elena's dad probably wouldn't have been there. And so God knew who would be the person that would shake up the entire group. I was talking to my brother, one of my brothers, when I was out in Indiana the first week we were here, and he was talking about, because they're, with the economic crisis and everything, people are trying to prepare and be ready for stuff. And he said, the interesting thing about this is, as I read through the prophets, that whenever God allows bad things to happen, or he was bringing the people of Israel through things, his message was not to prepare for the worst and get ready. His message was to depend upon him. And so often we become more self-reliant when we run into hard times instead of becoming more dependent upon God. And maybe what God is calling us to do as we go through these issues in our lives that transformation process is to become more dependent upon him, not more self-dependent. Now, we do have to prepare for things. When I go out and ride my motorcycle, I put gasoline in before I leave. And so we do prepare for things. But I also am depending upon God for safety. I was asked by one of the guys in my motorcycle club this last year if I believed in the resurrection. And I said, of course I do. I wouldn't ride a motorcycle if I didn't believe in the resurrection. And so every time we go out, and I meant that seriously, but every time we go out, we're depending upon God. I put gasoline in, I'm preparing, but my dependence upon God for safety there, the gasoline's not going to help. And that's what God wants us to do through all this. We're going to reach points of where there is no recourse that we have. And I tried to do everything. I remember going in the hospital and I said, I want to talk to the doctor. You get 1 hour a day when he's in the intensive care. For the family, the wife is only getting 1 hour. You get 1 hour a day, anybody can see him, and only 1 hour a day you can talk to the doctors. That's all you get in the whole day. And so I remember one day I was in there and I said, I want to talk to the head doctor here. And so the guy, because I figured I'd find out what was going on. They don't tell you anything. And so I asked, he came out, he was nice to me, and I said, what's this, and this, and he told me these whole things. Well, as I walked out, I realized, well, the guy was nice to me, but what I was trying to do was figuring, well, no one else is taking control of the situation. I'm going to take control, and we're going to get something done about this. Well, there was nothing anyone could do. The doctors couldn't even do anything. The only thing we could do was to become more dependent upon God, and that's what happened that last weekend. He had been in a coma for over a week at that point, and we sent out a prayer thing to all over. And you guys were praying. Beate, who was in the chat or someplace, I think, at that time, she told me a couple weeks ago, she was even praying. So I figured, if down in the chat, they have people who are hearing about this praying, and we have more churches in Africa than we do in America. And so they were mobilized, I don't know how many believers, these guys can tell us, we'll say millions of billions just to make it sound good, of believers in Africa who were praying, plus all the people here and throughout Europe. The Charis conference was going on in Europe, had gathered international leaders from our churches around the world, and they were praying every day. And we met together in Porto. We had a group that met And with our two churches, and Elena's dad was there, that was the time he prayed for the first time and held prayer meeting. On Sunday night, Gami came out of his coma. And God performed an unbelievable miracle. The doctors could not believe it. God worked through prayer. But God had to bring us to the point where the doctors, where we as a church, where everybody, we had nothing that we could do. And we're totally, we were preparing the funeral, seriously. It was pretty bad. And so, but anyway, one of the reasons I was going to share this is because it's still near my heart. But open to Psalm chapter 23. And I'd like to share a little bit of how David related in his walk with God, and shows us in the Psalms how God works in our hearts in that transforming process. And I want to read this. I'm going to read it from a different version than you're probably reading, one I haven't used before, because it causes me to think a little bit more on the words, to hang on the words rather than just reciting it. I could probably get everyone in here to recite it, probably from the King James. And I stumble over these words sometimes because as I'm reading it, I'm thinking the old version. But let me just read it here. It says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He takes me to lush pastures. He leads me to refreshing water. He restores my strength. He leads me down the right paths for the sake of his reputation. Even when I must walk through the darkest valley, I fear no danger. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff reassure me. You prepare a feast before me, in plain sight of my enemies. You refresh my head with oil. My cup is completely full. Surely your goodness and faithfulness will pursue me all my days, and I will live in the Lord's house for the rest of my life." Well, the first two verses there are described as that period of peace, of settled, of blessed time. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. You have the picture there of the pastures, and the still waters, and you can just get this idea of the calm that's there. And that's really what was going on in our church there in Porto for the first 11 years. As we were there was only good things to report. And then seeing a second church that came out of that, and the work started in Lisbon. And it was just like God was blessing. Every day there was something new. And God was taking care of his small group of people there. And there was exciting things going on. We had things happen that were bad, as I mentioned before, but it was like God always showed that he was victorious through those things. And it was the same in Gami's life as well. I had met him through, someone was just telling me here this morning, they've heard about Gami almost since we've been there, and it has been almost, because I met him as a university student in 1994, and he was part of our university group. He was part of the founding people of the Portuguese church in 1997. He met his wife in the university, who was not a believer at that time, but was somewhat a Catholic. She was a leader in the Catholic youth movement, and she was she's one of the few people, because a lot of Catholic people in Portugal do not read the Bible, and she was one who had really studied the Bible and was very spiritually sensitive. And she came to one of our retreats, and we were studying the book of Galatians, which just put all the pieces together for her, of someone who knew about and talked about faith, but was basing her faith upon, or her faith was based upon works rather than on faith in Jesus Christ and the grace that he offers to us. And she gave her life to Christ. And then we went through the process of marrying them. They were the first couple that we married in the church. And it was real neat to watch her, because the marriage was postponed because the parents didn't want her marrying a non-Catholic guy. And they wanted to honor the parents, and they waited to the place where the parents would come to the wedding. And they were there, and it was a neat process seeing that take place. And then Elena wanted to be baptized, but her parents were against it. And so she waited until her parents would come to the baptism. And that was about a year more later. But her parents were there for the baptism. And all along, she has honored her parents in the decisions that they made. They had a baby, Elise, that was born. And again, we had the baby dedication in the church instead of having the baptism for the baby like they normally do. And the parents were there. But they waited until the parents were willing to do that. And we've worked as a church with them through that process. And we're praying that her parents will come to Christ. He was very close at the time that he prayed in that prayer meeting. But like many people, once the crisis is passed and Gami's been resurrected, now he'll tell you that Gami, this was a miracle of God. If you talk to him today, he will tell you that God touched Gami's life and it was a miracle. But everything's better now, so you don't need God so much anymore. And next time a Christ will come, and so that's a lot of Portuguese people are that way, and we're praying for them that way. But this is the way things were in our community. We're with the church there. We're with Gami and his wife. Everything looked pretty good. But as with the psalmist, the bad things can come along, and this is what David writes here. He says, "He restores my strength. He leads me down the right paths for the sake of his reputation. Even when I must walk through the darkest valley, I fear no danger, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff reassure me." Now, it was interesting with Gami. It started out as a simple tooth infection, and we thought there was nothing of it. He would go to the dentist and he'd get the tooth yanked out and taken care of. Next thing we know, he's in the hospital. Well, it's no big deal. It's just a little more serious. Well, a couple days later, I get a call from his wife one night, and they're doing surgery on him, emergency surgery on him. I thought, this is a little odd, but whatever. And then a couple days later, they did another surgery on him, not knowing what was going on, and then he went into the coma. And it was just like everything went down. Here was a guy who was meeting with a Go team that we had a week earlier, was working, doing everything, and a week later he's in a coma laying in a hospital. And the downward slope went pretty fast. I mean, the worlds were shaken up for everybody, and in a lot of ways. And I can't go into all the details on that. But one thing I learned through all this is that often we think that God allows suffering to come into a person's life because their relationship is not good with him. Well, we learn from Job, of course, that is not the case. Many people that are leading very godly lives and are very close to God, God allows suffering. And I started to look back over some of my life, because often when we're going through suffering, we ask ourselves, we think, well, God's punishing us for doing something bad. And that was one of the lies Satan used with us, even with me, even as I laid there thinking, what would God have done what have I done that God is punishing me like this? I mean, it's like the church is going to be destroyed. Our leadership is wiped out. And we had other leaders, but you start to lose perspective in this. And Gami was the strong leader we invested so much in. And why would he allow a person to be taken away through a simple tooth infection? God can heal tooth infections. God can do anything. And why would he allow this to happen? It makes no sense. It's like we're going to be knocked back down to ground zero and be, after almost 20 years, start all over again. And these are the kind of things that go through your head. And this is what the church was thinking too. We had Gami as a strong leader, and now it's going to be taken away. What are we going to do as a group of people? And as I shared earlier, God worked through prayer in a mighty way. And you notice in this process here, and this is one of the things that Larry had brought out when he was sharing this with us, you notice that through the suffering, God brings us into a more intimate relationship with him. And this is that transformation process that I believe God has for us if we're willing to pray that prayer of letting him transform our hearts, letting him transform our lives, instead of simply teaching us something. And you notice in here he moves from a relationship that seems to be more distant in talking about God and he, and moves to a more personal of you are with me, your rod and your staff, they reassure me. And he moves through the suffering. He begins to realize where his true dependence needs to be upon. And as he has to depend upon God, his intimacy becomes much closer with God. And that's exactly what happened in our church there, and exactly what happened in our own lives, in our own personal lives. And we saw, just amazing things take place out of that. I mentioned about Elena's dad, also Abel, who's one of the guys that we've been working on in leadership, to develop toward leadership. During that time, expressed a desire to be baptized in the church, which is a huge move for someone coming out of a Catholic church. Abel's someone we've been working with for a number of years, but has really become active in the church during the last few years. And these are slow processes that take place and bring them through the steps toward that. And for him to express the desire to be baptized was something great, because that'll just run through the family. We've really targeted the men and the families, and have been able to see reaching families has been the real key to the church starting there. Even in our international church, there's been a real new emphasis on prayer. And after people saw this, people pray and they say, we believe in miracles, but when you see this, when you see the guy laying on the bed and then you see him walking a few weeks later, then you really believe in miracles. And every Sunday night now they have a group of people that go out after the service, and anyone that wants to pray or be prayed for comes out there, and we have that prayer time. And this is what God does, and this is what He did here in the Psalm. You notice in the last couple of verses, the picture moves. Now it started out, you notice, as a sheep being in a nice calm pasture, and that's pretty cool and that's pretty neat. But where it ends up is he is in the palace, and he is part of royalty. It says, "You prepare a feast before me in plain sight of my enemies. You refresh my head with oil. My cup is completely full. Surely your goodness and faithfulness will pursue me all of my days, and I will live in the Lord's house for the rest of my life." You notice in that first, "You prepare a feast before me in plain sight of my enemies." The bad things are not gone. They're still there, but they're at a distance because he realizes that God is taking care of him. And he is feasting in the knowledge and that intimacy of his relationship with God. And that's exactly what he did. So when we have another car accident, or we have someone who has a fatal illness, or we lose our jobs, or whatever it might be, we're looking at it differently because we're sitting in God's presence feasting, instead of being out there in the valley of despair, or the darkest valley, or however you want to describe it. And this is what God has done with the church, and I think really positioned it. We've been working, our goal is to be able to start other churches. And we have been working to move ourselves out of leadership in the church there, to be able to do that. And we've done things like starting motorcycle ministry and done other things. But I believe that God worked during this last year in really an amazing way of showing that church that they could live without Tim, or they could live without me, that their dependency was not on these human leadership, but it was on him himself. And through that transformation process in the church, I think he's brought them to the place where we will be able to really move on and do ministry in a different way of focusing on some new things and allowing that church to grow and multiply on its own. So as I wrap this up, the thinking on Psalm 23, I just ask you to think about a couple things. Think back over, I don't know where you are in your life. Maybe you're in that time of blessing, and I don't wish any suffering to come upon you so you can become more intimate with God. But maybe you are in that place of suffering. Maybe you are going through a time where you do not know how you're going to pay the bills this month, or you do not know, whether that person that's lying in the hospital is going to survive, or whatever it might be. Maybe you're in that. And so I ask you, and this is probably the biggest challenge for you, to join with me in praying that prayer, that God would not just teach you, but that he would transform you. That you would not be God's student only, but that you would be God's piece of art. Ask to be transformed. And it's a prayer that you will maybe wish at times, as I did, that you hadn't prayed, but the end result will be something that you have never expected. So let's pray. Father, I just thank you for the time to be able to look into your word here this morning and share some of the things that you have been doing in our lives. And I pray that this will be an encouragement to the others here. I pray that we would truly be your pieces of art here as a church and as individuals, not just be your students, but be pieces of art, that as people look at us even, we would be able to be testimonies of Jesus Christ because you have truly transformed our lives. And I pray that in Christ's name. Amen.